picture this. You just woke up. You're just lying there staring up at the ceiling.
Yeah, and let's just pretend for a second that you actually got a full 8 hours of sleep for once.
Right. A totally rare occurrence, I know. But even with those 8 hours, the second you open your eyes, you feel this, I don't know, this heavy, deep in your bones exhaustion.
Oh, honestly, I feel that. It's that awful feeling where the sleep didn't even, penetrate.
Yeah.
You're physically horizontal, but your brain is already running a marathon.
Exactly. You haven't even sat up yet. Your feet haven't touched the floor, and you're already reaching over to the nightstand. Your hand is just blindly searching for your phone in the dark.
Because it's pure muscle memory at this point.
Right.
We don't even consciously decide to do it anymore.
No, we don't. So you grab it, the screen lights up, blinds you for a second, and boom, you're just instantly hit with a wall.
Just a massive, heavy flood of demands.
Yeah. There are, unread work emails that seem incredibly urgent, a group chat argument from last night that's somehow still going strong, and, you see a push notification reminding you about a bill that's due tomorrow.
And then, almost without thinking, you just open an app.
Right, and as you swipe, you just see this flood of heavy, terrible news on social media, people arguing, natural disasters, economic anxiety, all of it.
It's just a lot.
It is. And before you even drag yourself out of bed, you feel completely, profoundly, mentally drained.
That honestly sounds like almost everybody now.
It really does. And it's something you hear everywhere. People are just walking around feeling utterly exhausted, even when they have technically rested.
Yeah, because it's a very specific kind of tired,
Yeah.
It's not the physical fatigue you get from going for a long hike or, building a deck.
No, it's not physical. It's a nervous system fatigue. Just a pervasive emotional and mental burnout.
Because we are constantly overstimulated, we're constantly processing thousands of data points, dealing with nonstop notifications.
And the sad part is, a lot of us internalize this. We really do. We think it's a personal failing. We tell ourselves, I just don't have enough willpower, or I need to manage my time better.
Right. We treat it like an individual moral failing, like we're just not strong enough.
But when you actually look at the research, which is exactly what we are doing today in this deep dive, you realize this is a massive systemic pattern.
It's not just you.
Exactly. And we've got a huge stack of sources today. We are looking at cognitive psychology studies from back in 2009, neurobiology research from Dr. Anna Lembke, the U.S. Surgeon General's 2023 Advisory on Public Health, sociological data on social media, and the clinical work of trauma experts like Dr. Gabor Maté.
That is a seriously heavy stack.
It is, yeah. But our mission for this deep dive is really clear. We are going to figure out, biologically and sociologically, why modern life is draining us so much.
And well, more importantly, we are going to look at how you can actually survive it without just unplugging your router and moving to a cabin in the woods.
So let's start with the very first thing you touched this morning. The phone.
The glowing rectangle of infinite demands.
Yes. Because to understand the biological root of our waking exhaustion, we really have to look at the mechanics of what is happening right in our hands, and specifically what it's doing to the deepest parts of our brain.
Right, because we all know the phrase attention economy by now.
Oh, right.
The idea that human attention is this scarce, highly valuable commodity that companies monetize.
Yeah, but Tristan Harris, he's the former design ethicist at Google, he frames this in a way that is just fundamentally unsettling. He calls what these tech companies are doing a race to the bottom of the brainstem.
Oof, that phrase honestly gives me the chills.
It's meant to, because we usually think of our attention as this high-level intellectual thing, but cognitive psychology breaks human attention down into two entirely different systems.
Right, you have automatic attention and controlled attention.
And understanding the difference between those two is like the key to understanding why you are so tired all the time.
So let's unpack the automatic side first. Automatic attention is deeply primitive. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism that lives in the older parts of your brain, like the amygdala.
Its entire job is to scan your environment for salience. It's constantly looking for sudden movements, loud noises, or highly emotional cues.
Like, if you're a hunter-gatherer, automatic attention is what makes you instantly turn your head when a twig snaps in the dark. It doesn't take effort. In fact, you can't stop it. Your brain hijacks your focus to keep you alive.
Exactly. It's completely effortless and deeply reactive. You don't choose to look.
Right. And then on the other hand, you have controlled attention.
This is the modern prefrontal cortex stuff. It's deliberate, intentional focus.
This is the attention you use when you are trying to read a dense contract, or write a complex essay, or even just sit still and listen to a friend talk about their day.
And crucially, controlled attention costs calories. It takes massive amounts of metabolic energy to sustain. It wears out.
Now, here is where the race to the brainstem comes in. The algorithms on our phones, the infinite scroll feeds, they are not designed to engage your controlled attention.
Not at all. If they relied on your controlled attention, you would get tired and put the phone down after 10 minutes.
So instead, they are explicitly engineered to bypass your logical brain entirely and hijack your automatic attention.
They basically mimic the snapping twig in the dark.
Yes. They feed you lurid, outrage-inducing, terrifying, or highly emotionally charged content because your biological hardware simply cannot ignore it. Your amygdala perceives it as an actual survival threat.
So you are sitting safely on your couch, but your brainstem genuinely thinks you are navigating a war zone. That is incredibly exhausting on a purely physiological level.
And we know these platforms operate on intermittent variable rewards. I mean, we've known for years that the pull-to-refresh mechanism is modeled exactly after a slot machine.
Because the unpredictability is the whole point. If you knew exactly what you were going to see every time you open an app, you'd get bored.
Right. But because you don't know if you're getting a text from a friend, or 100 likes on a photo, or absolutely nothing at all, your brain goes into hyperdrive.
Which brings us to some brilliant research by Dr. Anna Lembke. She's a psychiatrist who wrote a book called Dopamine Nation, and she completely dismantled how most of us misunderstand dopamine.
Yeah, because I think we all grew up hearing that dopamine is the pleasure chemical. Like you eat a piece of cake, you get dopamine, you feel happy.
But neurologically, that's incredibly inaccurate. Dopamine is not the experience of pleasure. It's the neurochemical of craving, motivation, and anticipation.
It's the drive to seek out the reward. It's literally what gets the monkey to pull the lever.
Exactly. And Dr. Lemke points out this fascinating but honestly terrifying biological mechanism. The brain is constantly seeking homeostasis. It wants balance.
She uses the analogy of a seesaw, right?
Yeah. If you dump a massive amount of artificial dopamine onto the pleasure side of the seesaw by swiping through highly stimulating content.
The brain doesn't just sit there. It actively fights back to restore balance.
Right. It pushes down on the pain side of the seesaw. It literally downregulates your dopamine receptors.
And here is the kicker. It doesn't just return you to neutral. The brain overcompensates. It drops your dopamine levels significantly below your normal baseline.
You enter what Lemke calls a dopamine deficit state.
Which means the moment you stop scrolling, or the moment the app gets boring, you don't feel relaxed. You feel an immediate visceral sense of anxiety, emptiness, and irritability.
Because your baseline has been artificially crashed.
I think this completely recontextualizes how we view our free time. Like we think sitting on the couch scrolling is resting.
But biologically, you are engaging in a highly volatile neurochemical loop.
Wait, so scrolling isn't actually relaxing. It's more like drinking salt water when you're incredibly thirsty.
I love that analogy. You get the split second of wetness in your mouth, but almost immediately the salt dehydrates your cells further and your thirst comes back 10 times stronger.
Exactly. You scroll to relieve the stress of the day. The scrolling spikes your dopamine, which forces your brain to crash your baseline, which creates anxiety.
So what do? You scroll more to relieve the anxiety that the scrolling just caused.
It's a closed, brutal loop.
Yeah.
And these tech companies understand this neurochemistry way better than we do.
They absolutely do. We've seen platform features that explicitly weaponize this deficit state, like holding back your notifications.
Oh, right. The algorithm will sometimes intentionally delay showing you the likes on your post, waiting until there's a bundle of them to deliver all at once, just to maximize that anticipatory spike.
Or they add artificial microsecond delays to loading screens. Not because the server is slow, but because that tiny fraction of a second of waiting actually heightens the dopamine release when the content finally appears.
That's just wild. So we spend our mornings and our evenings putting our brains through this exhausting artificial dopamine roller coaster.
And then we expect to just close our phones, open our laptops, and be perfectly focused, high-functioning workers.
Which is completely absurd when you think about it. If our brains are so depleted just from trying to relax on a Sunday, how are we physically supposed to handle the demands of Monday morning?
We can't. And that brings us directly into the workplace and this massive myth we've all bought into over the years.
The myth of multitasking.
Yeah. I feel like for the last 20 years, every job description required you to be an excellent multitasker.
Oh, it was a total badge of honor.
But cognitive neuroscientists have been practically screaming from the rooftops that the human brain cannot genuinely multitask. It is biologically impossible to process two complex cognitive streams of information simultaneously.
What you are actually doing is rapid task switching. You are violently yanking your spotlight of attention from one thing to another, back and forth.
And every single time you yank that spotlight, there is a severe, measurable cognitive cost.
This was heavily studied by a business professor named Dr. Sophie Leroy back in 2009, and the term she coined for this phenomenon is just, it haunts me.
Attention residue.
It sounds so sticky and gross, but it is perfectly descriptive.
It really is. Let's break down Dr. Leroy's methodology because it proves exactly why our modern workflow is destroying our mental battery.
Okay, so she brought people into a lab and gave them a task that required deep, focus-like solving complex word puzzles.
And for one group, she let them completely finish the puzzle, put down their pencils, and then move on to a second, totally different task. I think it was reviewing resumes for a hiring decision.
But for the second group, she interrupted them right in the middle of the puzzle. She told them, stop what you're doing right now, don't finish, you have to immediately switch to reviewing these resumes.
And the results were stark. The group that was interrupted performed significantly worse on the resume review task.
Because their attention didn't cleanly move over. A portion of their cognitive processing power was left behind, stuck on the unfinished puzzle.
Their attention was essentially smeared across the two tasks. That is the residue.
When you switch tasks before closing the cognitive loop, your brain doesn't just let it go. It keeps processing the unfinished task in the background.
This is actually deeply tied to a psychological concept called the Zeigarnik effect, which was discovered way back in the 1920s.
Right. The brain naturally remembers incomplete or interrupted tasks far better than completed ones.
Which makes sense evolutionarily. If you are building a shelter and get distracted, your brain needs to nag you to finish the shelter before nightfall.
But in the digital age, that survival mechanism is completely weaponized against us.
Just think about the average digital worker today. The data shows we are toggling between different applications or windows roughly 1,200 times a day.
Wait, 1,200 times? That is almost hard to comprehend.
It is. But think about it. You're writing a report, a Slack notification pops up, you click it, read it, realize you need to check an email to answer the Slack, you open your inbox, see 3 other urgent emails, answer 1.
And by the time you go back to the original report, your brain is just covered in thick layers of attention residue.
Exactly. You have left tiny fragments of your processing power on the Slack message, the inbox, the unanswered emails.
It's exactly like having 50 browser tabs open on your computer at the same time.
Yeah.
Even if you are only looking at one tab, the other 49 are secretly eating up your RAM in the background.
And eventually, the cooling fan starts screaming and the whole system freezes.
Yeah. And researchers estimate we are losing up to 40% of our productive cognitive capacity every single day just to the friction of this constant switching.
There's also data showing that after a major interruption, like a coworker stopping by your desk or a genuinely distracting phone call, it takes the average brain about 23 minutes to fully regain deep, submerged focus on the original task.
23 minutes. But who goes 23 minutes without a ping, a buzz, or an urge to check a feed?
Almost nobody. Which means the vast majority of modern workers are living their entire professional lives in a permanent state of shallow, fragmented attention. They literally never reach the deepest gears of their own intellect.
And this isn't just a psychological feeling. It's not just brain fog. We are talking about physical, neurological consequences.
This is the part of the research that I found genuinely alarming. Chronic task switching and living in this state of continuous partial attention actually alters the physical structure of your brain over time.
Right. MRIs show that heavy digital multitaskers have reduced gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex.
Let's explain why that matters. The anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC, is a crucial region in the frontal lobe. It's heavily involved in emotional regulation, error detection, and complex decision-making.
It's essentially the part of your brain that helps you manage stress and prioritize what is actually important versus what is just loud.
So when you are constantly bombarding your brain with microstressors, every ping, every switch, every unresolved cognitive loop, you are flooding your system with cortisol.
And chronic cortisol is neurotoxic.
Mm.
Over time, it literally preens the dendrites in your brain. It wears down the gray matter in the exact area you need to maintain control over your focus.
We are physically eroding the biological breaks we need to stop the feeling of overwhelm.
That actually makes so much sense. I mean, I never thought about it like that, but it perfectly explains that physical sensation at 3 p.m. where you stare blankly at your computer screen and realize you cannot comprehend a single sentence.
Or the severe decision fatigue at 6 p.m. where someone asks you what you want for dinner and the question feels like a physical attack.
Honestly, I feel that.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily because you dug ditches for 10 hours.
Yeah.
It's because you spent 8 hours forcing your brain to rapidly shift gears 1,200 times while bathing in a cortisol bath.
You are forcing your brain to run a marathon through quicksand.
So when you take this daily, microscopic friction of attention residue and constant dopamine deficits,
And you stretch it out, you scale it up over months, years, decades of chronic workplace stress and digital connectivity.
you arrive right at the epicenter of our cultural epidemic.
Burnout. We throw the word burnout around incredibly casually now.
Yeah, people say, I'm burned out on this TV show, or I'm burned out on cooking chicken.
It's become a catch-all term for just being tired of something. But clinically and psychologically, true burnout is a very specific, profound, and dangerous phenomenon.
The World Health Organization actually officially recognized it a few years ago. They included it in the ICD-11, which is their global diagnostic manual.
But the way the WHO defines it is very narrow. They explicitly categorize burnout strictly as an occupational phenomenon. They state clearly that it is not a medical condition.
They say it is characterized by 3 main dimensions: deep feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance or cynicism toward your job, and a reduced sense of professional efficacy.
Basically, you have no energy, you hate what you do, and you feel like you're failing at it anyway.
Now, I have to push back on this WHO definition, and a lot of the sources in our stack push back on it too. Wait, is it really just about the workplace?
It feels a little too neat, doesn't it?
It does. The WHO insists we shouldn't confuse it with medical or psychiatric conditions. But many top clinical psychologists argue that this separation is totally artificial.
They argue that in modern society, the label burnout has actually become a sanitized, socially acceptable euphemism.
Exactly. It's a euphemism for occupational depression.
Because when you look at the actual physiological and cognitive symptoms of severe late-stage burnout, complete anhedonia, which is the inability to feel joy, massive sleep disruptions, intense cognitive impairment, memory loss.
Those symptoms heavily overlap with the clinical criteria for major depressive disorder.
But calling it burnout makes it palatable to corporate culture. It almost sounds like a weird badge of honor.
Like, I was just so dedicated and I produced so much value for the shareholders that my battery simply ran dry.
It frames the human being as a machine that just needs to be plugged in for a weekend retreat, rather than admitting that the systemic environment is causing profound psychiatric distress.
This debate around what is actually a natural response to a sick environment leads us perfectly into the work of Dr. Gabor Maté.
His recent book, The Myth of Normal, is an absolute paradigm shift for understanding this exhaustion.
Dr. Maté is a physician and an expert on trauma and addiction, and his core thesis in this book is incredibly confronting.
He argues that what Western industrialized society calls normal is actually deeply toxic.
We view the baseline of our culture, the relentless productivity, the normalization of extreme stress, the separation of mind and body, the constant emotional suppression. We view all of that as healthy.
And if you can't keep up with that baseline, you are the one who is sick. You are the one who needs therapy or an SSRI.
But Maté completely flips that. He says the baseline itself is pathological.
He points out that the very traits our culture celebrates, rewards, and promotes to the C-suite are actually making us physically and mentally ill.
Think about the people we hold up as the ultimate success stories. The people who can work 80-hour weeks without ever complaining. The people who can compartmentalize their emotions perfectly.
The people who can completely ignore their body's desperate signals for rest, nutrition, and connection in order to meet a quarterly goal.
We call these people highly driven, resilient, or top performers.
But Maté looks at those exact same behavioral profiles and sees something else entirely. He sees unresolved early emotional wounding. He sees severe trauma responses.
He focuses heavily on the science of psychoneuroimmunology, which is a long word, but it basically means the mind-body connection isn't just a spiritual concept, it's hard biology.
Your psychology directly regulates your nervous system, which directly regulates your immune system.
So if you are spending decades in a state of chronic emotional suppression, pushing down your authentic human needs for rest, sadness, or boundary setting in order to meet the external demands of your job or society.
Your body keeps the score. That suppressed psychological stress chemically translates into systemic, low-grade inflammation.
And that inflammation is what leads directly to the explosion of autoimmune diseases, chronic migraines, fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue syndrome that we're seeing today.
Maté identifies a very specific behavioral archetype in the source material that I think will resonate deeply and painfully with a lot of people listening.
He calls it the driven woman archetype.
Yes, and obviously this applies to men as well, but the societal conditioning for women makes this particularly acute. These are highly ambitious, incredibly successful individuals who are deeply, fundamentally disconnected from their own bodies.
Because from a very young age, society rewards them massively for their output, their caretaking, and their performance.
But it heavily, heavily penalizes them for showing any messy, authentic human needs.
The book provides this chilling case study of a woman named Shalini.
Right. She is a 37-year-old founder of a highly successful company. On paper, she is the absolute picture of modern wellness.
Yeah, she exercises every single day. She has a mindfulness practice. She takes all the optimal supplements. She eats a pristine diet.
But despite all of that optimizing, she suffers from debilitating chronic migraines and has been diagnosed with 2 separate autoimmune conditions.
And when Maté interviews her, he uncovers the most telling detail. She describes her relationship to rest as suspicious.
She physically cannot sit quietly on her couch for 10 minutes without feeling a creeping, overwhelming sense of dread.
Because compulsive achievement has become her primary coping mechanism for anxiety.
If she isn't crossing something off a list, she feels like she literally doesn't exist. Her entire sense of worthiness is tethered to her output.
That's kind of depressing, honestly.
It's devastating because it forces you to realize that what looks like pure, laudable ambition on the outside
Is very often just profound, anxious attachment, dressed up in a tailored business suit.
You are running an endless race to prove your right to exist, to prove your worth. But the finish line is a mirage. It never actually arrives.
And eventually, your biology intervenes. Your body realizes that your conscious mind is never going to allow you to rest.
So the body just says no more. And it forces you to stop through a sudden illness, a panic attack, or a complete physical collapse.
It's an involuntary shutdown protocol.
So we have this vivid, slightly terrifying picture of the modern individual.
Their neurobiology is being actively hijacked by algorithms and dopamine deficits.
Their daily cognitive focus is fractured into 1,000 pieces of attention residue.
They're burning out trying to meet deeply pathological standards of productivity.
And they are performing constantly for their bosses, for their followers, for their peers.
But fundamentally, at their core, they are completely disconnected from their own authentic internal state.
Which leads us directly and logically to the next massive crisis in our stack of research.
The societal epidemic of severe isolation.
The loneliness paradox. We are currently living in an era where we are more digitally, seamlessly connected to other human beings than at any other point in the history of our species.
I mean, we could text anyone on Earth in a millisecond. We see the intimate details of hundreds of people's lives every single day.
Yet, structurally and emotionally, we have never felt more profoundly alone.
In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, issued a massive, unprecedented public health advisory on this exact topic.
He officially elevated loneliness to the level of a national public health epidemic.
And the statistics in this advisory report are just breathtaking.
The data shows that approximately 50% of adults in the United States report experiencing measurable loneliness in recent years.
Half the country. 1 in 2 people you pass on the street is living with this silent weight.
And the Surgeon General goes out of his way to prove that the toll of this loneliness is not just a poetic, sad metaphor. It is raw, hard biology.
The report explicitly states that the physiological health impact of prolonged chronic loneliness is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Let's unpack the mechanics of how that is even possible. How does a feeling equate to inhaling tar and nicotine?
It comes back to evolutionary biology. Human beings are a profoundly social species. For hundreds of thousands of years, being separated from the tribe meant certain death from predators or starvation.
So when your brain perceives that you are socially isolated, it triggers a low-grade, constant fight-or-flight response?
Your cortisol levels stay elevated. This chronic stress hormone disrupts your sleep architecture, meaning you don't get deep restorative sleep.
It increases your blood pressure. It causes systemic inflammation that damages your blood vessels.
Over time, this constant physiological strain increases your risk of premature death by nearly 30%. It raises the risk of heart disease, stroke, and dementia.
The Surgeon General concluded that chronic loneliness is as statistically dangerous to your physical health as clinical obesity or the lifetime of physical inactivity.
That is terrifying. But here is the detail in the data that I think shatters a lot of our assumptions.
When we typically think of the word lonely, we usually picture the elderly, right?
Exactly. We picture an 80-year-old widow living alone in a house or someone in a nursing home who doesn't get visitors.
But that is not what the demographic data shows at all.
No, the epidemic is actually hitting young adults ages 15 to 24 the absolute hardest.
They report the highest rates of intense loneliness. And the second hardest hit demographic is middle-aged adults, roughly 30 to 44.
These are the people who are supposedly in the absolute prime of their social, academic, and professional lives. They are surrounded by peers at school or in offices.
So we have to ask the obvious question. What is driving this structural shift? Why are the most networked generations most isolated?
Well, you simply cannot ignore the glowing rectangles in our pockets. The role of smartphones and social media in this crisis is the subject of a massive, fierce, ongoing sociological debate.
Our sources highlight a really fascinating study out of Oregon State University that looked into this.
They studied a broad demographic of adults aged 30 to 70.
And they found a striking correlation. Being in the top 25% of social media users literally doubled your odds of experiencing severe loneliness.
But the detail that caught my eye wasn't just about the total hours spent online. Frequency mattered just as much, if not more, than duration.
Meaning it's not just the people sitting in a dark room doom scrolling for 3 uninterrupted hours.
No. If you only check your phone for 30 seconds at a time, but you do it 100 times a day while waiting for an elevator at a red light during a lull in a conversation, that short burst, constant checking is just as strongly linked to profound loneliness.
Because you are never fully present in your physical environment. You are constantly fracturing your reality.
Now, in the interest of genuinely looking at all sides of this research, we have to talk about Jonathan Haidt.
Right. Haidt is a social psychologist who recently published a highly influential and highly debated book called The Anxious Generation.
He takes a very hard, definitive stance. He argues that the rapid transition from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood, which happened roughly between 2010 and 2015, is the direct causal mechanism for this mental health crash.
He points to the staggering data from that exact time period. A 134% spike in anxiety among youth and a 106% spike in adolescent depression.
Haidt argues that the smartphone, specifically front-facing cameras and infinite scroll algorithms, completely rewired adolescent brain development.
He says it displaced sleep, displaced physical play, and replaced it with a permanent 247 social comparison engine that young brains were simply not equipped to handle.
He is arguing for strict causation. The phones caused the epidemic.
But there are prominent critics of his work, and we need to report their methodological views impartially to really understand the scope of the debate.
A lot of sociologists and data scientists argue that Haidt's data, while alarming, is fundamentally correlational.
Right, the golden rule of statistics. Correlation does not equal causation. Just because the adoption of smartphones and the rise in depression happened at the same time does not definitively prove one caused the other.
These critics argue that blaming the phone is almost too easy. It's a technological scapegoat for much deeper, more complex societal failures.
They point to it is a valid, incredibly complex methodological debate, and it's important to see both sides.
It is. But honestly, even if the data is purely correlational, you cannot deny the visceral reality of the feeling itself.
The feeling of what we might call existential loneliness.
Yes, that specific hollow sensation of feeling completely, utterly separate from the world around you, even while you are staring at a screen proving that 1,000 people are looking at your pictures.
It's the realization that digital connection is a remarkably thin substitute for physical presence, and surviving on it is emotionally exhausting.
And here is where the research takes a truly dark turn. This exhaustion, this anxiety, it might not just be a passive experience.
Wait, what do you mean?
We might actually be catching it from each other, like a virus.
You're talking about the Facebook emotional contagion study.
Yes, this is one of the most unsettling studies in our entire research stack. It was published in 2012 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS.
Let's lay out exactly what the researchers did here, because the methodology is shocking.
Data scientists at Facebook intentionally manipulated the algorithms governing the news feeds of almost 700,000 users.
And to be clear, they did this without asking for explicit, informed consent from those users. It was buried in the terms of service.
For one massive group of users, the algorithm was tweaked to artificially reduce the number of positive, uplifting words and posts they saw in their feed.
And for another group, they actively reduced the number of negative, sad, or angry words.
They wanted to see if human emotion could transfer through a purely text-based digital medium without any nonverbal cues.
And what happened?
It worked. The user's own behavior shifted to match the invisible manipulation of their feeds.
The people who were unknowingly force-fed less positive content began to independently generate and post more negative, sad, and pessimistic content themselves.
And vice versa. The people who saw less negativity posted more positively.
The emotions literally transferred through the screen.
The researchers concluded that this proved the existence of massive-scale emotional contagion.
Just think about the implications of that for a second. When you are doom scrolling through an algorithmic feed that is explicitly optimized to show you outrage and fear because it captures your automatic attention,
You aren't just objectively reading the news. You aren't a detached observer.
your nervous system is actively mirroring and syncing up with the panic, the anger, and the dysregulation of millions of strangers.
I never thought about it like that. We are absorbing the anxiety of the collective.
We are swimming in an invisible, engineered sea of shared dysregulation. No wonder we wake up exhausted.
So if we step back and look at this entire web we've uncovered,
We've got the slot machine mechanics hijacking our brainstem.
we've got the cognitive friction of attention residue destroying our focus,
We are dealing with chronic burnout stemming from pathological productivity standards.
and we are absorbing the emotional contagion of a profoundly lonely, isolated society.
The ultimate question of this deep dive becomes, how do we actually survive this?
Right? How do we heal a nervous system that has been so deeply structurally dysregulated by modern life?
Well, the first step is building the internal awareness to actually identify that dysregulation in your own body.
Because most of us are so used to the stress that we don't even know what a relaxed baseline feels like anymore.
You have to know when you're stuck in a sympathetic state.
The sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight mode. It's the gas pedal.
And the signs that your foot is stuck on the gas are pretty clear once you know what to look for.
It's a racing heart when you're just sitting at your desk.
It's a persistent tightness in your chest or a knot in your stomach that never quite dissolves.
It's a feeling of emotional numbness or a strange detachment from the people sitting in the exact same room as you.
And tying back to the driven woman archetype, it is an absolute crawling inability to relax during your downtime.
If you feel a wave of guilt the second you sit on the couch to watch a movie, your nervous system is trapped in overdrive.
So how do we fix it? And I mean structurally, beyond just taking a pill or going on a one-week vacation.
The experts in our stack focus heavily on behavioral restoration and environmental design.
Because, as the saying goes, you can't medicate your way out of a toxic environment.
Let's start with our digital environment. Cal Newport has some incredibly practical, if slightly painful, advice here.
Newport is a computer science professor who coined the concept of deep work.
And his core argument is that we have to actively, intentionally embrace boredom.
Which sounds awful. Nobody wants to be bored.
It feels like an itch you can't scratch. But Newport argues that boredom is actual medicine for your brain's neuroplasticity.
He says you have to consciously stop pulling out your phone every single time you encounter a moment of friction or waiting.
When you're standing in line at the grocery store, just stand there. When you're waiting for an elevator, just look at the wall.
You have to retrain your neural pathways to tolerate a complete lack of high-octane stimulation.
Because if your brain loses the capacity to tolerate minor boredom, you will never, ever be able to sustain the deep focus required to do meaningful work or engage in deep relationships.
Newport also recommends a very specific behavioral tool called a shutdown ritual.
This addresses the attention residue problem directly.
Right, at the very end of your workday, you don't just close your laptop and walk away. You create a deliberate, structured routine.
You spend 10 minutes writing down every single outstanding task. You make a concrete plan for how you will handle them tomorrow.
And then you explicitly, verbally tell yourself, my work is done for the day.
It sounds a bit silly to say it out loud, but it sends a psychological signal to your brain that it is safe to close all those open cognitive loops.
It prevents you from dragging the sticky residue of your inbox into your living room and into your bed.
Okay, so that helps manage the digital friction. But what about the physical, biological exhaustion?
For the physiological side, Dr. Andrew Huberman, a neurobiologist at Stanford, strongly advocates for a protocol he calls NSDR.
Non-sleep deep rest.
This is essentially a modern scientific umbrella term for ancient practices like yoga nidra.
It's usually a guided audio track that walks your brain waves down into a state of profound, deep relaxation. but it keeps you hovering just above the threshold of actual sleep.
Huberman's lab has shown that engaging in NSDR for just 20 to 30 minutes can significantly restore your brain's dopamine baseline.
It actively clears out the cognitive fatigue and metabolic waste in the brain, helping your autonomic nervous system finally shift out of fight or flight and back into the parasympathetic rest and digest state.
He also champions a brilliantly simple real-time breathing tool called the physiological sigh.
This is something you can do literally anywhere. You can do it in the middle of a stressful Zoom meeting, and nobody will even notice.
Let's explain the mechanics of it. The physiological sigh consists of 2 quick consecutive inhales through the nose, followed by 1 long, extended, slow exhale through the mouth.
The absolute key to this is the double inhale, and ensuring that the exhale is significantly longer than the total inhale.
Right, because of how it affects your lungs and heart. When you are stressed, the tiny sacs in your lungs, called alveoli, start to collapse. Carbon dioxide builds up in your bloodstream, which signals panic to your brain.
That double inhale forcefully pops those collapsed alveoli back open.
And the long, slow exhale offloads massive amounts of that trapped carbon dioxide.
Neurologically, a long exhale also slows down your heart rate. It sends an immediate hardwired signal via the vagus nerve to your brain to halt the release of adrenaline and cortisol.
It is a biological override switch for panic.
But as useful as these protocols are, the deepest healing probably requires a fundamental shift in how we relate to ourselves.
Which brings us full circle back to Dr. Gabor Maté.
Maté practices a therapeutic approach he calls compassionate inquiry.
And the philosophy behind it is just incredibly profound.
We spend so much of our lives looking at our own burnout, our scrolling habits, our fatigue, and we aggressively ask ourselves, what is wrong with me?
Why can't I just handle this job? Why am I so weak? Why don't I have the discipline to put my phone down?
We constantly pathologize our own exhaustion.
But Maté says we need to fundamentally change the question. We have to stop asking, what is wrong with you?
And we need to start gently asking, what happened to you?
Your symptoms. The chronic fatigue, the anxiety, the doom scrolling, the desperate need to constantly achieve.
They aren't signs that you are broken or weak.
They are highly intelligent biological adaptations. Your body is communicating with you in the only language it has.
You have to cultivate the courage to ask, what is this symptom trying to tell me?
In almost every case, it is telling you that the way we are currently living, the pace, the isolation, the digital immersion, is fundamentally misaligned with what human beings actually biologically need to thrive.
So if we look at the big picture of everything we've explored today, is modern life becoming mentally unsustainable?
If we just stay on autopilot, yes. If we passively let the slot machine algorithms dictate our attention and let hustle culture dictate our worth, then absolutely it is a path to systemic collapse.
But the hopeful part is we do not have to live on autopilot.
We have choices, even if they require effort to enforce. We can intentionally disconnect from the noise.
We can radically, aggressively reduce our screen time and protect our baseline dopamine.
We can deliberately slow down our mental pace and refuse to multitask.
Because true, lasting healing doesn't mean optimizing or hacking your body just so you can be a more productive worker.
It means leaning into real life with all its friction instead of running from it.
It is about prioritizing raw, unedited, messy, physical human connection over curated, frictionless digital performances.
We have to face our internal reality, our actual needs, our actual fatigue, our actual sadness, instead of constantly burying it under a mountain of digital noise.
We want to turn this over to you listening to this right now.
Do you also feel this deep structural mental drain from the pace of modern life?
Do you wake up feeling that heavy exhaustion or find yourself doom scrolling just to numb out the stress of the day?
We really want to hear your personal experiences with this. Please leave a comment, start a discussion, and share your story with us.
And if this deep dive resonated with you or helped explain something you've been feeling, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with someone in your life who might really need to hear it today.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
A reminder that simply ignoring the fatigue or distracting yourself from the anxiety never actually makes it disappear. It just stores it in the body.
Keep your emotions in front of your mind, not hidden behind your back, lest they eventually attack.
Sources used for this episode are listed in the description.